Alright, welcome back. So these kind of command and control regulations are not necessarily the best way to implement climate change mitigation policies. They can be part of the set of tools in our toolbox for implementing such things, but I think we can do better. And so we're going to next investigate these more market-based solutions. There's a certain type of politician and a certain type of blogger and so on who's going to say the invisible hand of the market's going to make all this happen. The invisible hand of the market can do a lot of things. Climate change is not necessarily, though, the invisible hand of the market's best thing to try to solve. I mean, if you take a kind of Ayn Rand-esque process to this, the thinking is, gosh, if all these the power companies, if they keep emitting carbon into the atmosphere, there'll be changes, and the public won't like those changes in terms of the climate, and the public will, divest in those coal companies or those power companies, and it'll be bad for the companies. That's awfully hard to see it actually happening. I mean, if climate change starts happening, climate change is happening, but I mean, if it becomes a big enough thing that people are starting to, divest in coal companies and divest in power companies and so on, it's kind of too late. Okay, so this is not necessarily the kind of thing that the free market is necessarily so great at, but that doesn't mean that we can't engineer market-based solutions that work to incentivize emitters to reduce their emissions. And the two main strategies that are involved here are either carbon taxes or cap-and-trade systems. Carbon taxes are what they sound like. You make a tax on how much emissions your power plant or your industry or whatever is emitting. So under this policy, emitters can do whatever they want. They can emit as many tons of greenhouse gases into the atmosphere as they choose, as long as they pay whatever the fee is associated with every ton of carbon that they emit. And you can engineer this to have really remarkable, you can design this to have really remarkable impacts on our climate change and our carbon emissions for relatively little money. Your book walks through an example that's actually a little bit, it's a little bit tedious, but it's worth our work to see how this would actually happen. Let's say we had two power plants, plant A and plant B, and they both currently emit, your book uses the figure 10 tons of carbon per year. Okay, they emit, scale that by 1,000. They emit 10,000 tons, or they emit 10 million tons, or something like that. But we'll just work with nice little numbers here. We'll say 10 tons each. And they have very different technologies behind them. One's older, one's newer, one's coal-fired, one's natural gas, whatever. They're very different power plants. And therefore, for each of them to make their changes to the amount of greenhouse gas they're emitting will cost very different amounts of money. It's going to cost a different amount for the coal plant than the natural gas plant or whatever. And for both of these plants, but we'll focus on plant A first, there's a law of diminishing returns when it comes to their ability to reduce their carbon emissions. It's going to cost a certain amount of money to reduce the amount of carbon, but the marginal costs get higher and higher. At first, we can actually make some fairly simple changes, update some cheap equipment, and make relatively big changes to the amount of carbon they're emitting, but every step along the way gets more and more expensive. And you'll see how these changes in the marginal costs are going to work out as to how this carbon tax is going to work. So what I've done here is I've actually reproduced a table that you see in your textbook here, and we're going to work through. The book makes it a little hard to sort out what's the point of the table. So let's actually point out here, I'm just going to zoom over here just to the part of the table that's about A. And what I'm going to show you here is every row on this table is a plan of action that plant A could adopt as a way to address its emissions. And so, for example, one thing plant A could do is choose the top row of this column where they don't make any reductions in the amount of carbon that they emit. Their reduction is 0 tons, so their emissions are still 10 tons, and they've spent no money to make those changes. Okay? On the other hand, for example, they could reduce their emissions by 2 tons. So they have, the first column shows that they reduced their emissions by 2 tons, which in the second column shows that now they are emitting 8 tons. Now, there would be costs associated with those reductions, and the first ton only cost them $1 to reduce the emissions, but the second ton cost them $2. So their total emissions, the costs associated with making those changes to their technology and so on were $3. Okay, again, remember, we'd be multiplying this by like 1 million or something at a real power plant here, but we're just working with small numbers here. Same way, we could actually have the plant make even bigger changes. Maybe they could implement different, carbon capture and sequestration technologies or whatever, and reduce their emissions to just 5 tons. But that's going to cost a lot more. In fact, if you go over all the way to the farthest right column, you see that costs them $15 to implement those technologies. Again, remember, we're multiplying through by 1,000,000. Now, as is, with just the magical invisible hand of the market, Plant A doesn't have any motivation or any incentives to make any of these changes because every cut to these greenhouse gas emissions cost them money. If you don't do anything to this company, there's no reason why they would ever want to reduce their emissions. But, okay, let's impose a carbon tax. Now, in the book, the example they work through is they say, let's impose a tax of $4 per ton of carbon emissions. Very simply. So what I'm doing here is I'm just adding an extra column to the table here that is Plant A's tax bill for each of these options they could have chosen. So for example, if they had chosen that plan of just not reducing their emissions at all, they're still emitting 10 tons of carbon. At $4 a ton, that's $40. That would be their tax bill. If they chose to make no changes. But here's the deal. Go down one row from there. If they just reduced their emissions by 1 ton, which cost them practically nothing, they only had to pay $1 to make those simple changes, they reduced their tax bill by $4. So they spent $1 but saved $3. That makes good sense, and a company is of course going to do that. For them, it makes good sense to make that choice. And you can work your way down the table and see that if they reduce their emissions by 2 tons, okay, that would cost them $3 to do that. Cost a little bit more because it's harder to make that second ton of improvement, but it reduces their tax bill by $8. Of course they're going to spend $3 to save $8. That makes sense. And they could keep going where they're on their table here, and if they spent $10 to reduce their emissions by 4 tons, they would save $16 on their tax bill. Of course they're going to spend $10 to save $16. That makes good sense. The economics work out. And if they keep going down farther and farther down this table, though, look what happens if they try to reduce their emissions 1 more ton. Let's say they try to reduce their emissions by 5 tons. Okay, well, to do that, they have to spend $15, and their tax bill will now be $20. So here's the deal. They just spent $5 to get that next ton of emissions, but remember, saving a ton of emissions only reduces their tax bill by $4. They spent $5 to save $4 on their tax bill. Well, that's not a rational thing to do. The plant probably would not choose to do that. And so under this carbon tax structure, the most reasonable thing for Plant A to do would be to reduce its costs until it was no longer cost effective for it to do so, which in the case of this technology that Plant A is using means that they would be reducing their emissions by 4 tons. And they did it by only spending $10 on that. Now, I mean, again, really, this would all be scaled by like millions or whatever. But now let's take a look at what would happen at the other plant. This is Plant B. Now, Plant B is, again, some kind of different technology. It also has a law of diminishing returns on its ability to save money on its, to improve its emissions. There's some cheap things it can do to make the first changes, but every change they make after that costs more and more money. And again, if we apply the same sort of logic and look through the table here at each row being a scenario as to what they could do and how much money they would save and how much it would cost, I won't work through it all, the book does, but the book works through and shows that for the Plant B, the most rational thing to do would be for them to reduce their emissions by 2 tons, and it works out that they would save $6 by doing, it would cost them $6 to have done it, but they would have reduced their tax bill by $8, well, of course the plant's going to choose that. They're going to have saved $8 by spending $6. It's the rational thing to do, but if you go farther down and try to save a 3rd ton, you end up spending more money making the improvements than you save on your tax bill. But check it out. The 2 plants together managed to reduce their emissions by 6 tons. One plant reduced them more than the other because its cost structure was different. And the total amount of money that they spent, I thought I had it on a slide here, but I don't. Whatever that amount of money was, I think it's $16 between the 2 plants. Yes, it's $16 between the 2 plants. It's not bad. In fact, the book then works through a separate example of what if you had done this with a command and control regulation instead. If you wanted to save 6 tons of carbon, a simpler solution would have been to say, let's just make each plant reduce its carbon by 3 tons. Well, then they work through the math and show that actually costs far more. Okay, if you actually try to make that Plant B reduce its carbon by 3 tons, you cost that plant far more money. Meanwhile, plant A could actually make bigger reductions from that and still have made financial sense. So the command and control regulation there just didn't really work compared to that market-based carbon tax example. So as our example just showed, by creating a relatively simple carbon tax, all we made is a rule that said $4 a ton, all the plants were motivated to find some savings. But each of them found different amounts of savings based on what worked for them. Now you might say, well, why would any of these companies want to pay a tax in the first place? Wouldn't they fight this? Well, sure, they'll fight it, but the truth of the matter is these companies aren't really paying the tax. Companies, in many ways, don't pay taxes. Companies collect taxes. It's really coming from the consumers. All they're going to do is pass the costs on to the consumers. And so this actually, and if the consumers are willing to vote for politicians that make this happen, clearly the consumers are okay with this. Carbon taxes the costs are just passed on to consumers and the prices go up. Now, again, the book works through the example here that shows what actually happens is the taxes result in the prices going up more for the technologies that weren't able to make efficiency changes cost effectively. And so there is going to be lower prices for the greener options and higher prices for the carbon intensive options. And especially if you phase this kind of tax in slowly over a period of years, with it getting higher and higher in coming decades, it creates more and more incentive for the companies to change to whatever technology turns out to be the greenest. If the coal plant turned out to not be able to reduce its costs as much as the natural gas plant was, then there's when the company that made the coal-fired plant needs another plant, they're probably not going to choose coal. They're going to choose natural gas. This makes sense, and this is a wise public policy, but it does involve raising taxes, and you know darn good and well that there's a certain kind of politician and a certain kind of blogger and a certain kind who, for very good reasons, says all taxes are bad. But the truth of the matter is not all taxes are bad. Carbon taxes are not bad. A well-designed tax actually serves useful economic purposes, like reducing carbon dioxide emissions. On the other hand, the prospects for carbon taxes in the United States are just not good. There's just too much power of the kinds of groups who are opposed to any kind of tax for this to work in the United States. At the present time, there is, when I'm recording this, there is in fact a ballot initiative in Washington State for them to become the first state that actually directly taxes carbon, which is different from like fuel taxes and so on. Fuel taxes are largely paid to maintain roads and things like that. To directly tax the carbon itself, that Washington State could become the first state to do that this fall. But at the present time, none of the 50 states have a carbon tax. That being said, this is actually done all over the world. In fact, lots of European countries individually have carbon taxes, and I gave you a giant list of them there. There's not a European Union level carbon tax at the present time, but individual countries do tax carbon emissions. Before we move on and talk about cap and trade type solutions, though, let's do two quick questions here. Question 3. A carbon tax generally incentivizes companies to A. Switch to environmentally friendly energy sources such as tar sands. B. Switch from coal to oil for power. C. Reduce their carbon emissions until it's no longer cost effective to do so under the tax structure. Or D. Not pass on to not pass the cost of the tax on to the consumer. What does a carbon tax incentivize a company to do? Make a choice from those 4 options and get a little feedback before you move on to question 4.